I hate army painting. The thought of painting the same miniature the same way 100 times kills my boners until this very day. It just feels so much better to paint something really nice. And yet, I decided I wanna start a new army this year. So why would I put myself through this torture? You see, I hate army painting, but I like owning painted armies. And so I'm on a quest to find the fastest, most convenient and enjoyable ways to paint Warhammer armies without losing my goddamn mind. But Zumikito, if you hate army painting, why don't you just hire a commission pay f*** you? Yeah, I might actually do that later. And the first one to try on the list is Slapchop. You know, I always avoided this technique because I'm just not that guy, but also I already own an airbrush, so like, what's the point? For the sake of this video, I'll keep my mind open and I'll test it on these guys and rate it at the end. But first, you should know, if there is one thing I hate more than army painting, it's army assembling. But luckily for me, I have just the right solution. No. Wakey, wakey! It's time for assembly!
Yes, by the weekend. Yes.
Okay, the miniatures are ready. Let's dance! So after that radical montage, let me share with you the strategy. First of all, I am using a textured palette for dry brushing, which, in theory, should help me get the right amount of paint in a brush. Instead of using pure white or grey and white like a basic bitch, I wanted something more spicy. So first, I am using lilac. I gotta be honest here, dry brushing these beautiful models felt very wrong. And neither could I get the right paint consistency. The paint was supposed to be dry, but this was too dry. And despite being careful, I couldn't avoid some texture built up on the armor, and that's especially true for the first swooping hawk. Maybe I could have been more careful, but at the same time this is the first midtone, so I shouldn't be too picky either. Turns out I also applied too much pressure and the wings broke off. Or maybe I should blame the goblin in my basement for doing a poor job. Either way, this worked in my favor because the bit is now easily accessible. As you'll see, using dry brushing has this big disadvantage because you can't get everywhere, and therefore some parts will be left unpainted. On the other hand, leaving those parts darker can work just fine, because maybe those parts wouldn't be exposed to light. With the second swooping hawk, I did much better job of getting the right paint consistency. Not too dry and not too wet either, so this felt like something I could work with. And from that point on, every additional mini looked better than the first one. As I mentioned, instead of using pure white, the next layer will be different. With pale yellow, I still have a really light color, but it has more saturation. So in theory, it should give me way more juicy result in the end. In this case, using a smaller dry brush is definitely the way to go. See? Bigger is not always better. Since we won't go any lighter than this, I just wanna paint the most exposed parts like the helmet, some of the edges, and not too much of the legs. So I can't use the sheer brute force of the big dry brush. Do you know how sometimes you get to a point when painting where you tell yourself, this looks like shit? Well, at this point I definitely hit that. I guess this is only natural when army painting, but whenever I'm painting a standalone display model, it feels much more rewarding, because in my process every part has to be finished before moving to the other one. Still, even though I fully realized that, it felt like I was wasting these minis because they might not live up to their potential. Like, for example, how the hell am I supposed to paint the little details just with dry brushing? There's no way I can paint islands like that. Additionally, despite the fact that these guys had most of the mold lines removed, there were these little scratches on their helmets and shoulder pads, and dry brushing them definitely didn't help. But again, I kept my mind open and we'll see where the Slapchop takes us. Dry brushing done? Contrast time. Contrast paints might be the single most useful tool in this army painting series. At the end, I wanna have a playable Eldar army. And aside from the characters, I think most of the minis will see some contrast paint usage. But we'll see. For now, I've prepared some of my favorite contrast paints, as well as some express colors from Vallejo. Using wet palette when applying them is a good idea, as long as you don't overthin them. And with the preparations complete, it's time to see whether these guys will still look like shit, or if they become the shit. And wow. Right after a few brushstrokes, this felt miles better. I intentionally went for this very saturated Iyanden yellow, and the result speaks for itself. The subtle surface texture became much smoother, and yet the dry brushed highlights stayed just as prominent. Now, this might be second nature to many of you, but for me, since I am not used to army painting this way, it felt very rewarding. Holy shit! Am I having fun? I also think that using more saturated contrast paints works better than the white one or the really dark ones, because it has that necessary punch. Using a bit thicker coat is also completely fine, maybe even recommended, because that way you get more saturated staining. And there was just something in my primitive brain that found dragging that extra thick layer of paint very satisfying. Ooga fucking booga. For the armor, I wanted something between blue or green. So I created my own mix and went for another thick coat. Again, the subtle texture from dry brushing was heavily mitigated. So let's see how it works once I covered all of them. So as I started painting the helmets, I noticed 3 important things that I'll have to fix. First of all, although the texture was reduced to some extent, it was still quite visible on certain parts, especially on the first dry brush swooping hog. This would be acceptable and I kinda expected it going in, but the second problem is a fair bit worse. You see, contrast paints or washes have a tendency to fill the recesses, but that includes the gaps on their shoulder pads and scratches that were created when sanding down the mold lines. And even that might be acceptable, however, I have to draw the line somewhere, and that's at painting the details and the eye lenses. For me, if the lenses or the gemstones are not done, it would be like going for number 2 and not wiping your ass. I guess someone does that, but that someone wouldn't be me. Please trust me, I do wipe my ass. And so, after dry brushing my minis and applying the contrast paints, I had to do some touch-ups with regular acrylics, because otherwise I just wouldn't be happy with them. The easiest fix were the weapons. Simply adding some more layers on top, focusing on what is exposed will do the trick. The contrast layer got us like 90% there, so just adding on top of that took very small amount of time. And by the way, so far it took me around 4 to 5 hours to get to this point, which is fine, but I think that this additional step might take me just as much. The next problematic thing are the helmets. In every other video I mentioned that your focal points should be really nicely painted, because usually that's where people look first. The head of your model is almost always one of the focal points. And so, by putting extra effort there, you get the best bang for your buck in terms of results. I mean, let's be honest here, who's gonna look at the feet anyway? Right? Right? Aside from fixing the mask and painting the lenses, I had to touch up their yellow helmets. Of course, other details were painted as well, but those took me like a few minutes at most. The helmets, on the other hand, could take me just as much time as the entire dry brushing stage. Pretty much the same thing I've done for the weapons was also done for the armor. Those ugly gaps won't fix themselves. I mean, I won't go over them with milliput, but just by going over them with a single layer will make the green armor much more digestible. Adding some edge highlights to the top half is also quite useful. And just so you know, I only care about the front and not the back. After all, this is just supposed to look good on the tabletop, and it's not a display piece where the back would actually matter. So when it came to any details like the gemstones or the runes, it's the main viewing angle that I cared about. Before calling it with these guys, I also painted the base. And most importantly, I should mention that painting the rim of the base can be really tricky here. This technique is called rimming, and I would highly recommend getting help from someone else, maybe your partner, because if it's done right, it's super satisfying. And before even attempting it, just Google rimming real quick, because you don't want to ruin those beautiful bases. Trust me on this one. Now, if you're wondering whether I'm gonna paint my entire army like this, well, no. I wanna test all the different painting methods and approaches to see whether I can make army painting faster, easier, or just straight up more enjoyable for me. In this case, I feel like I did enjoy it, but I gotta admit, just using Slapchop by itself wouldn't give me the result I wanted. However, just by adding some touch-ups, I have something I wouldn't be ashamed of on the gaming table. Initially, I wanted to say that Slapchop is a good way to start, because you can just work on top of that. But then I realized there must be a better way, right? And don't get me wrong, if you wanna use Slapchop on your minis, just do it. It's super fast, it's very convenient, and it's miles better than having unpainted plastic. For me though, I gotta test different methods before coming to a conclusion about Slapchop. If I only talked about Slapchop with no touch-ups whatsoever, the result is certainly not where I would like it to be. On the other hand, the speed is quite good. It took me like 4 to 5 hours to dry brush everything and then carefully apply contrast paints on top of that. And then it took me about just as much to further refine them. But then again, what if I just used my airbrush to sketch the midtones and the highlights, or apply a zenithal highlight with a spray can? So for now, Slapchop gets 5 beards out of 10. Not great, not terrible, but that might very well change in the next video. And to see that one, you better hit that subscribe button. And see you there.